This is Season 4, Episode 4 of Mastering the RPG, a tabletop RPG podcast all about upping your game. Doesn't matter if you're a game master or player, you'll find advice, ideas, and some strong opinions. Our episode tonight is Creating an Engaging Non-Combat Encounter, or Don't Be a Murder Hobo. Welcome to Mastering the RPG, the tabletop RPG podcast. Just like I said, we're all about maximizing your game. We got ideas, cool stuff found, and all sorts of cool stuff that we try to bring into the episode. I'm Carl with my co-host tonight, Chris, because Eric is gone for the evening. And you can find information about the show at masteringtherpg.com. That's one word. Send us some email, feedback, or questions, anything, to gamemaster@masteringtherpg.com. That's also all one word. So it's good to be back on the mic. I'm kind of bummed that Eric can't be here, but he had other things that were much more pressing, and we completely understand that. But hey, Chris, how are you doing this fine day?
I'm doing well. I had a pretty busy day today, but I'm looking forward to talking to you and kind of decompressing, getting my mind on something else.
Awesome. Anything exciting going on in the gamosphere for you these days?
Sure. The Foundry VTT, the official marketplace, is coming out, and so there's a lot of hubbub about that. It's going to be pretty interesting. There's going to be a lot of big publishers on it, and they're all preparing in their own unique way. So that's kind of cool to watch happen. And then in the Savage Worlds realm, they're getting ready to release another Deadlands Kickstarter, so that is kind of cool too. And there's a lot of ramp up for that I get to kind of see behind the scenes of.
Very cool. Me, I'm just doing some gaming stuff, normal, but I was watching the Gamehole Con event list, just seeing how it looked. And I've got almost all my events, I got 4 of them, are full wait lists, which makes me happy. And if you're listening to this, event registration for Gamehole Con, October 17th to the 20th in Madison, Wisconsin, starts on the 31st. Get yourself a badge. Come on out. It's a very big RPG type convention versus something like Gen Con, which is like everything, just overwhelming. Yeah. Gamehole's very focused on RPGs for the most part. So it's a great convention.
I would say Gamehole's my favorite of all the RPG conventions.
Very cool. Yeah, it's really nice, and the facility's pretty nice, and Madison's a nice smaller town, kind of got a good vibe to it. It's a college town, so there's a lot of interesting places to go and hang out if you're so inclined to do so. So it should be a lot of fun. So I can't wait to see if my games sell out. I'm hoping they do, and we'll see. So next time we get on the mics, I'll probably know what happened there. So anyway,
I'm gonna go look.
Yeah, you can go look.
I gotta go see if any of my games. I have 4 games there too. I didn't even see if anybody signed up yet.
Yeah, well, the sign up doesn't start till the 31st.
Or the wish list.
But the wish list, yeah, the wish list.
Yeah.
I snuck a peek at that because I was very curious. One of them only has one person on the wish list, but it's the early game on Thursday, so maybe people are kind of like hedging their bets a little bit on that one because it's the first one out the gate. So. Anyway, tonight was kind of cool because we do have a cool stuff found that 2 of them actually, which is great. So let's go ahead and do our cool stuff found. We have cool stuff found. Do you copy? Cool stuff found. Over. All right, welcome to Cool Stuff Found. I'm going to turn it right over to Chris. He's got an item that he wants to share, which I was pretty excited when I saw it. I thought that was the coolest thing ever. That's obviously a Cool Stuff Found.
Over at Gen Con, everybody was talking this year about the Arkham Horror RPG starter set, the Hungering Abyss. And this is an RPG that descends from the board game of the same name, I believe, which... in its ancestry comes from Call of Cthulhu through some different board game iterations. It has a ton of stuff in it, dice and tokens and pre-gen characters, maps, little handouts. It came with a little like fake newspaper thing. It's pretty awesome as far as having little bits you can hold onto and share. The production quality seems to be pretty good. The pages are a little thin to me, but that's about the only thing I can say. I've heard, I haven't played it yet. I just looked through it, but from what I understand is it is sort of geared toward people who are board gamers coming into RPG, and it's kind of caters to that. And the amount of material in here is pretty much good for playing this little adventure that it comes with, and expanding on that is probably going to require the full game when it comes out. But overall, it's very good. It was $35. Everybody wanted it there. So I'm really kind of anxious to play it.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, I was reading the website and it looks like some really nice production values. I guess the pages are a little thin, but I mean, otherwise it looked pretty fantastic, to be honest. So
Yeah. Yeah.
and then I've got an item called The City of Arches from Mike Shea, known as Sly Flourish, the Lazy Dungeon Master. He has a Kickstarter going on right now for a supplement called City of Arches, and it's all about a city that has these mysterious arches in it that go to the different realms and different planes of existence, and nobody quite knows how they work. Occasionally one opens and people come through, so it can be very cosmopolitan. And they used to be controlled by what they called the Nameless. I think they call it the Nameless King now, because he's been erased from history because he tried to take over the multiverse by taking advantage of these arches. And what's kind of cool is Mike Shea puts there's about a 41-page just downloadable PDF that has a whole bunch of material in it, so you can really get a flavor. I think more Kickstarters should do that. So you can get a lot of flavor and understand what he's going to present. It's got some campaign arcs. He mentions it's for D&D 5e, but I actually backed it, and I'm not a 5e player. I think there's going to be a lot of good material for other systems in it. So about 2 days left by the time this audio drops. So if you're interested, you'll have to jump on that really quick, because I think, unless I do it early, but usually when it comes out on Wednesday, there'll be about 2 days left on that Kickstarter. So that's the cool stuff. So excellent. Very good stuff. So we'll go ahead and get right to that main topic. All right, welcome to the main topic. We're going to be talking about creating engaging non-combat encounters, which obviously are not combat encounters. So I don't know, did you want me to take the MC role on this one, Chris, and walk us through it, or did you want to take the helm?
I would like you to do that.
Okay, beautiful. I will more than happy to do so. So first thing, obviously, is we need to talk about what a non-combat counter is, besides just it's not a combat encounter. So what does it really mean, a non-combat encounter? Why don't you kick us off? What does it have? What is it? What is it not?
Sure. I'll start with what is an encounter, right? You have, typically we're used to the combat ones, right? You're fighting, you have something you are going for, some kind of stakes, some kind of sense of urgency. You're doing something, and there's multiple rounds or stages, right? That's just an encounter in general. So we're going for non-combat means that all of these are determined without the use of combat. So we have, social scenes, chase scenes. There's really that was one of the little mini discussions we had coming up with these. Is there's really so many. It's just how do we solve issues of stakes and urgency without combat every time, right? So that is a non-combat encounter.
Yeah, so I think you started hitting on it. Some examples are like you could have those social interactions, like there could be an argument at a trial. You're the prosecution or the defense trying to convince the judge of your side. You could be in a chase, fleeing a ruins just before you get squashed by a big boulder. Ick, gross. And it might be a trap or a puzzle that's multi-stage, requires multiple skills. You got to walk through it. You got to think through the problem. It's not just I found a trap, I roll a skill roll, and it's over. It's really something that requires thinking and working through it. But what are some things then it's not? What What are we not talking about besides the fact that it's not combat?
Yeah, we're not talking about things that are like where there's low urgency, researching documents in the library, or crawling on a map across uncharted terrain. You're doing a couple survival checks, but there's really not a time thing going on. In the short term at least. Walking around a building or going through the halls of an abandoned house. Those things like that are not specifically encounters in the way that we're meaning them right now.
Yeah, and I think you might say, well, the researching something in a library, that's kind of an encounter, but not the way we're defining it, right? We're talking about something that has stakes. There's probably, not unless something happens in a library, then there might be stakes, but just going and researching, you're taking time, you're doing things. It doesn't have that sense of urgency. You're doing something, but it's not really what we're talking about in a combat encounter. I mean, otherwise, everything in an RPG is an encounter. Everything you do is an encounter. If you don't, we have to slice it down a little bit to make it easier to digest in a hour format. To be honest
Yeah.
with you. Now we all know when combat happens, right? That's when we're got the bad guys and we're trying to take them out. But why, or when? What's the reason we're going to bring in non-combat encounters into it? But maybe we should talk about the different components before we get into that, though.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
yeah, what's kind of some of the different kinds of non-combat encounters are we talking about then?
All right, so we have like puzzles. You need to figure out a solution to something to move past an obstacle. Traps in the way that are not like a bear trap, but like in a complex trap type of a manner, maybe where things are changing over time. Social interactions. You are trying to petition the king or queen for, you need them to be their allies, and you need it in a short term because there's decisions that need to be made right now. Chases, either after somebody or away from somebody, or just environment issues, right? There's an earthquake or there's a building on fire. Any of these things have a sense of urgency and a stakes, and they are not solved with the sword.
Yeah, and man versus world right there. So so then with those different kind of concepts in mind, why and when would we use them? I mean, the obvious first one is it brings kind of the spotlight to different players, right? In combat, you've got the barbarians and the combat people who are really good at combat, and you have folks who maybe not as good. They've got more skills. They're skill based, or they're the face character or whatever. It really allows for that spotlight because a puzzle is going to be different, and social interactions are going to be much different than the kind of skills you're using in combat. So it does give people who have different builds an opportunity to shine a little bit, and rewards those players for investing in those skills versus, I feel like I'm combat ineffective, so I'm not having any fun in this game at all. And it gives some opportunity as the players get spotlight. It gives them opportunity to kind of demonstrate their own growth as a character, right? I'm using my skills and the way I'm describing how I use them and the way I'm narrating it out. I'm getting you get a better feel of who my character is and how they are, all through this non-combat, swing and a miss kind of thing. You've got how you're interacting socially, how you engage with the environment. It teaches something about your character and gives you some growth. So, what are some of the other things that why we would do them?
One of the things that I'm not even sure I wrote on my notes here, but 5e in particular, not to like harp on 5e or anything, but there's a lot of like we mentioned it a little bit earlier, but there's a lot of the game that specific in leveling and character design or choices that all have to do with combat, and there's very few like you leveled up and you got a new thing. That new thing is usually combat. It's not like my new thing is talking or my new thing is chasing. So yeah, this is just like a little bit on what you already said, is that there's so many like other systems that really put a lot into that if you're just really combat focused, you're not going to get it at all. So that's just a side note.
Hmm.
Richer narration, though the narratives can be far more defined too if we are really going into what stories we're telling, and we can tell different types of outcome rather than everything was always a skirmish.
Cool. Yeah, and because it's you're got that richer narrative, you got more things going on. It brings diversity. It gets. I mean, even the people who love banging heads against the wall and they're going to get tired of combat all the time. It gets to be a drudge, no matter how clean the system is. And we like Savage Worlds with the fast, furious, and fun, right? But even that would get dull if you just did combat all the time. So it's really nice to have something that brings diversity, changes things up, throwing a puzzle or a trap in there, really kind of makes the game a little more interesting. And then I think,
Yeah, it breaks.
yeah, go
I think
ahead.
it like breaks the monotony of it and kind of gives you a non-repeated pattern, so people don't know what to expect.
Yeah, for sure. Yep. And because they don't know what to expect, there's creativity, right? So
Yeah,
people have to think about stuff and get out of their comfort zone as way as they thinking. Now, I mean, when we get into some of these things, when we talk about stuff, there's always that danger of player knowledge versus character knowledge and whatnot and that sort of thing. But we'll talk a little bit about that for sure. So any other thoughts of what makes them something that we'd want to do before we move on?
um, I mean, we hit most of the big points here. I really just want to reiterate the creativity component here. Is that there are people, builds, and solutions that are just never visited if you're always doing combat, like outsmarting somebody, in a more of a mental way than a strategic way. Using items in your inventory for more than just combat. Slipping there was the old game Zork was.
Yeah.
There was a key in the keyhole, and you had to use the letter opener to push the key out and land on a mat and pull the mat back, and you had the key from the other side of the door. Spoilers, by the way, if anybody hasn't played Zork yet.
Yeah, you might get
Uh,
eaten by a Gru too, so be careful out there.
yeah, yeah. So that kind of thing, I think, is really interesting to me. And those games had a lot of non-combat. It wasn't always combat back then.
Well, because you wouldn't survive combat, right? Normally in
Yeah,
those old text adventures, if you're the one who's dying if you get into combat for sure. And there's a lot of games too that like Traveler or something where you get into combat, your day's going bad anyway. That's the last thing you want to do
yeah.
is get into combat because it's so deadly. So yeah, and I think probably a lot of people are saying, well, yeah, that's duh. We got other things other than combat, but you'd be surprised at how often the other things just are setting up combat. That's their whole job is they just set up a combat. We're talking about doing things that aren't there just to support combat. They're interesting things in and of themselves, and they're an encounter that has meaning, narrative information that comes, drives the game forward, and isn't just a prelude to a combat. So yeah. It's all got nothing but goodness, right? Goodness, goodness, goodness. But what are some of the main pitfalls that you perceive that people run into when they are doing non-combat encounters? Because combat's easy, right? Most of the rules have combat really down to the T. 5 foot squares and how do you move and what can you do? And there's an edge that gives you this per positive or negative, and so they're really well defined there. But when you're talking non-combat, it's a little bit different. So, what do you think some of the pitfalls are?
Yeah. So, as you said, the combat's very defined, and depending on which system you're playing, the non-combat stuff may or may not have like a subsystem, very well laid out for it, for different things. Like we mentioned, Savage Worlds does have a very specific chase mechanic, but other games don't. So a lot of it relies on the GM or DM themselves to kind of come up with it. And in both pro and con, because following a rigid system can be less creative, or it can be less frustrating as well, because you have easier boundaries that are set, and what's expected of you during each one. But if it's not run well or in a intuitive, predictable manner, at least, it's not going to be super exciting, and it's going to be more frustrating, and if the GM isn't really good at bringing in narrative aspects or interesting aspects, it itself might not be so awesome to go through.
Right. I mean, you got to make sure you have all those key elements, right? Stakes, urgency, there's a reason for it. Otherwise, it's just, I use the example. It's kind of like you're just going to the store to buy some milk. I mean, is that an encounter or is that really useful? It's not exciting. It doesn't have real stakes. It doesn't drive the story forward. And another thing that we can do is now we get excited about them, then we overuse them, right? Now we're using them inappropriately. Again, sometimes a pit is just a pit. You don't have to have a complicated, there's a search and there's 5 different things that have to go on. Sometimes it's just a pit and it's just a trap that the thief gets his one roll and magic happens. And sometimes it has to be a bigger puzzle, a bigger trap. So be careful not to turn everything that is just a simple roll into a large, complicated scene just because you can.
Yeah, for sure. And this is like throwing it right back to how combat ends up being, is that you use that for it to answer all questions or to solve all problems, because that's the best tool in your toolbox. So hopefully, if you're bringing in non-combat solutions, aka everything else, you have lots of tools in that toolbox, and you won't try to force something for the wrong type of thing.
Yep, for sure. And kind of playing into that, because we've been talking about allowing players who don't have combat skills to take advantage and get spotlight and stuff like that. I mean, but you still need to read your room, know your group. Some groups just may not be interested in certain kinds of things. Puzzles they may just hate puzzles. I'm one of those folks who's not a fan of puzzles because puzzles are really hard to be done right, and I do them poorly, so I don't use them a lot. But they may just hate them. And so read the room, understand your group. That's a pitfall, Not every one of these encounters types we're talking about is maybe appropriate for everybody.
Yeah, that's all very accurate.
Very accurate. Yes.
So
a lot of people looking at you dumbfounded when you're like, it's like, look it, I got a puzzle. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I've seen that many times. As that person, the people who don't like puzzles pick up their phone right then and let the 2 or 1 that do try to solve it. So I think we touched over this earlier, or at least I brushed upon it, is the system mechanics, right? We need to, or we don't need to, but your system may or may not have very specific ways to run these type of non-combat encounters. So if it doesn't, you should at least have a plan about how you're going to do it ahead of time, because doing it on the fly like that may or may not be successful.
Yeah, for sure. And I feel a lot of systems are trying nowadays to have some kind of, not necessarily directly like a chase mechanic like a Savage Worlds would have, but more of a mechanic that represents multiple skills that have to be used in a particular order to get something done. Savage Worlds has things like dramatic tasks and I forget the other one, but it's got quite a few that are all about sort of those non-combat encounters. I think some systems, they aren't as clean on that, but they do have a way of having skill challenges of some shape or form. So just understand how your system uses that, so you can leverage that and build upon it. You don't necessarily have to home rule a whole brand new system just to be able to do, an interesting trap. Now I need trap rules. Well, you don't. Most systems will help you out with that, at least some form or shape. You just need to tweak it to your advantage.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and then of course, finally, just don't turn this the opposite, right? Some games turn into just combat for combat's sake. Don't turn it into non-combat for non-combat sake. And then, it's all a balance. Make sure that you don't ruin the flow of the game by having too many of, there's the thing that's called the 5-room dungeon, and it's kind of, there's a puzzle or there's something that you have to figure out. There's something you discover. There's something you have to fight. And it just really kind of takes all the different options and sort of puts them together in one place and one kind of framework take advantage of that sort of thing as you're building these out, so that you have flexibility and balance, I should say, not flexibility, but balance between all these different encounter types, because you can swing the pendulum too far the other way as well.
Yeah. And speaking of, just a side note on Five Room Dungeon, if anybody's planning on writing material, that is a great way to write your first piece, just because it's so structured, and you can kind of know exactly what to do, and then you learn from there or whatever. But that Five Room Dungeon is a great resource.
Yeah, and by the way, on Tabletop Tango, your friendly neighborhood Savage Worlds channel that I'm one of the hosts of, we did a episode on the 5 room dungeon and how it applies to Savage Worlds. But it's a good general video, even so, even if you're not a Savage Worlds player. But check it out. Sure, go check it out. That's cross promotion. That's a good thing. I like that. So
Yeah.
all right, so we've got pitfalls, right? There's some things that could go wrong, some things you got to think about. So let's talk some before we get into each individual kinds of non-combat encounter you might run into. What are some general tips that you would offer to a game master who's bringing these into his game or her game?
I think since typically they're less well known and less understood, non-combat encounters, that is that you want to sort of pepper your story or your sequence of events that leads to it with some foreshadowing or some hints at what's to come. So when they get there to do their puzzle or have their persuasive conversation or run their chase, that they've sort of anticipated a little bit. So number one, the players themselves are more prepared, and number two, so the characters could potentially also be more prepared and have things that will aid in those type of endeavors. Because people shop for weapons and armor, but do they ever shop for non-combat encounter types of things? Probably much more rarely.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in the old D&D OSR days, where it's like you got to go buy your caltrops and you got to buy your ball bearings and you buy your your powder, so that you can check to see if somebody's gone past these and roll to see if the floor is tilted. That's the way you play in the old days. So it's for your non-combat encounter, your trap checking. So I know I'm going to bring this one right up to the top, and it's kind of goes along with how we talked about don't swing the pendulum too far. Try to be as inclusive as possible. So find ways that everybody can participate. We talked about how, they're nice because the combat people get a lot of spotlight when they're attacking and doing things in combat, and the non-combat people don't. Don't flip it the other way. That when that face character is, talking to the king and trying to, convince them to do something or to go to war, the other players should have some kind of interaction that they also can be taking place to contribute to the story. And we don't have all the players just sit there now for 30 minutes while the face player role plays, being the courtly gentleman, and the barbarian, maybe he sees something and he sneaks around and he does something. Give everybody a chance to participate, just like everybody does have a chance to participate in combat. I think that's a big one.
Yeah, I think keeping that in mind is going to help people make better choices when they're leveling up and be more confident in their choices, that they're not going to go to waste. So they get a little bit more investment in their character. And not to mention, you should also just be aware of the character balance that you do have, right? You don't want to try to add in social conflicts or social encounters if you know that you don't particularly have a social person, either player or character, in your party mix, right? In your audience. Maybe this one isn't good, or maybe chases aren't good for these guys.
Yeah.
So sort of know your players and know what works well with them.
Right, and that's a really good point. It goes back to really kind of knowing your table. Not all of these different pieces are good for everybody. Like we said, we don't like puzzles, and if nobody likes to talk and everybody role plays in the third person, my character does that, they may not want to be sitting in front of the king orating to convince them. So yeah, for sure. And then we mentioned a little bit about system mechanics. Understand how your system does these things, and then, like we said, prepare working within the system as it is. So the mechanisms they have, prep how to work with those systems or work around them if they seem like they're not suited for that. Just so you know that when the time comes, you're not fumbling around and then just fall back to well, I'll just have the thief roll, lockpick, and that's good enough because I'm not ready to understand what it takes to do, like in Savage Worlds, a dramatic task, in D&D, a skill challenge, and different games, different things. I'm not prepared. So be prepared because it isn't something you're not probably used to as much, right? You're used to doing combat, running combat. It's easy peasy, that it's plus to this, plus to that, rolling with advantage. Here's something that might be a little different for you that you haven't done. So don't feel bad to, just kind of do a little homework before.
Yes. And then the last one I want to say is keep your failure option, like know what that is. Like if they can't talk the king into helping with reinforcements or they can't figure out the trap, I mean, the campaign doesn't end right there. I hope don't all go home. So, we need to know what happens if they, I mean, this is true for combat encounters too, but since the non-combat might be newer. Yeah. Don't know what happens. If you don't succeed, have a path that way too, that still can eventually lead back to the rest of the story or the rest of the campaign.
Yeah, I think people would be, I don't know, I have a feeling folks would be less okay with I'll call it a total party kill on a non-combat encounter than they get combat, right? They're attacking, things are happening, the dragon bred fire and everybody died. Haha, I hated that happened, but I knew what happened. But the fact that you weren't able to convince the king and the whole campaign comes to a screech. Oh, well, I guess my next thing where we all went to war and you guys got to be lieutenants and well, I guess that whole part of the game is over. I'm sorry. Let's all start a new campaign because we couldn't do that. I have a feeling people would be less enthused about that than maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe so.
Yeah, I guess if you don't want to be well prepared, I suppose when you initially get your characters to hand you their backstory, you can write out their failure outro within. So, when the campaign suddenly ends later on, you just, okay, so-and-so goes to a nearby village, lives out a life as a tavern keeper, eventually he's robbed and bad things happen. And this is where this went.
There was I'm going to go on a tangent, but there was a game called, I can't remember the name, but it was back in the 64 days. It was, you kind of made choices that geared your life. You're in college and somebody asks you to a party. Do you go? Well, yes. And so that kind of takes you down the path of partying and maybe you don't do as well in school. If you say no, it takes you down. I had a character that he played it straight and narrow. He was the goodest guy. And then at the age of 50, he gets hit by a baseball at a baseball game and dies. It's like, wait a second, come on. That was my outro for my character. He was like perfect. Why couldn't he last longer? But anyway, that's an aside. If anybody remembers what the name of that game is, I would love them to send me an email and say, this is what that Commodore 64 game was, that you got to play out your life by answering a bunch of questions, because I can't remember the name of it, and I'd love to know it. Anyway, that's an aside. But, there you go. So those are some of the general ideas. And then we can start talking a little bit more about the specific areas, the different things. And let's start off with kind of the one we alluded to a couple of times in previous, the puzzles. That thing where players have to solve something to go somewhere or get something. And that's a very big trope in TV and movies and books, right? The puzzle.
Yeah, the fact that puzzles come up so much is puzzling in itself. Generally, it's thought that puzzles aren't a great idea in RPG games, as far as I can tell, like the 51% consensus. But that's only because the line is blurred really between what does the character know and what does the player know. And often, something would be simple for the wizard, but the person playing the wizard has literally no idea. So we have to somehow take that into account and abstract it in a way that uses the game mechanics to still make people feel accomplished and like they overdid won or beat a puzzle without really requiring them to solve it all the time, probably most of the time. So that's the first thing I want to say is make sure we understand what the player knows versus what the character knows, and what the player's skills are versus what the character's skills are, and have a way to resolve that.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the classic social skill discussion, right? What you got the player who's playing a face character who's not a strong orator, who's going to, wax poetic as he talks and role plays. He may or she may not have that dexterity of words but still wants to play the face character. So now you really need to talk about their skill as part of their character versus the fact that the player themselves is able to make that. So that's a classic thing that we struggle with in RPGs is the social interactions. And I guess I jumped ahead on the social action, but it really plays into this, that player knowledge versus player skill. Now, old school D&D, player knowledge was kind of a big deal. You're the one who had to remember to look behind the tapestry to find the secret door. Your character, who cares, But I think that's really not. That's frustrating. I think you mentioned it, right? It gets people frustrated, and it's like my wizard should know, speak friend and enter. They shouldn't be scratching their beard and have a hobbit tell them, right? I mean, that's that's not how
and
it
this
should
is
work.
a good time. This is a good time when the GM should know when to step in, right? He knows when the player has reached a limitation that the character would not have reached, and asks for that roll or whatever. Hey, so and so, why don't you give me a perception roll? And if it's successful, you go, you think you noticed something over here, right? You scan and you do this, and that kind of picks it right back up where it may have gotten left off if you just left it to player knowledge totally.
Right, for sure. And then one of the things also is use different kinds of puzzles, right? So not just intelligence; they could be any skill based. You were mentioning it like. That perception could be like an occult roll in Call of Cthulhu, and that occult roll tells them something about the trap that they can then use to help solve it, or the puzzle to help them solve it. It could be something that requires dexterity, and this is where the rogue character still has a big place to play, even though they're not necessarily trying to disarm a trap or do anything like that. They're working on the puzzle, but it takes dexterity of hand, and that skill plays into them reaching and being able to turn the gears a certain way to line them up. And then the person who's got a high intelligence, they're making rolls to say, oh, I think we need to line them up in a certain way to make this happen. And before you know it, you got a Stargate that you've solved the puzzle and things can happen. So that's kind of the thing, but it can go terribly wrong. And there's and here's an example of what not to do. So I played a convention game years ago where the person thought they were very clever, and it wasn't a bad time, but they thought they were clever because they brought real puzzles with them. So the first puzzle was we had to figure out a combination for a lock. And so we figured out the combination, and the person handed us a school locker lock. And I don't know about you, but it's been a long time since I was in school, and none of us at the table remembered how to open a school locker. Oh, so you turn it 3 times and then back one around completely, and nobody could figure out. And he just sat there and stared at us for 30 minutes, and we're thinking, going, character knowledge versus player knowledge. The players don't know how to do this, but the characters know how to open a lock with a combination. Just let me make a roll, or just let it happen. Better yet, just make it happen, because I've already figured out what the combination is. So, and that was one of them. That was just the weirdest thing, and there was just a whole bunch of puzzles very much like that. Some of them I got, because I got a background in electrical engineering, so we had to build a circuit. And it was like, oh, I can build a circuit. That's easy. And that puzzle went quick. But, again, player knowledge versus character knowledge. So do you got an example of a good one or a bad one? Or what? You got an example of a good puzzle?
I only have examples of bad puzzles.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I don't even know if I can think of one that I've seen successfully go over. The most successful one I can see, I can only abstract, which was very similar to what you said, is it was in stages. Everybody's skills came into play. It was very similar to like a dramatic task type of thing. Everybody had a chance to roll, and at the end, and the narration of the GM is what made it really interesting. Was describing how this puzzle was being solved, even though we weren't really doing that. Our characters' roles were doing it. But I don't know that I have a specific example. Usually, there's really bad examples.
So I guess our takeaway is puzzles are hard. So,
Yeah.
so then let's talk about traps. Are traps easier? So let's talk about
Right.
some advice for those folks who are trying to make traps more interesting. Again, we're talking about not traps where I see a trap, I roll my thievery roll, I've disarmed a trap, we move on with their life. These are more interesting, multi-stage, complicated things. So what's some advice you might give to somebody who's bringing traps into their game?
Uh, you as the GM, or I believe you as the GM, want to make the fact that there is something to solve obvious, and not make
Yep.
them find it and then solve it. Because then this is another frustration thing. It's like, I can't get past this point, and I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. So an obvious complex trap is better, because you can see what is there. You can start investigating it. You can start working on it. So it's going to be difficult enough, to figure it out. You don't really need to find it per se. There can be a clue, a ticking time bomb, clock counting down, or a device that makes it obvious, something so that they can actually get started on the challenge rather than looking for the challenge.
Right. Yeah, for sure. That like there can be they can see the big plate that you step on and bad things happen. And the more interesting thing is you see the gears and you see the pulleys and you see, now what are you going to do to get past this, versus I have to roll to find the plate. And if I didn't, oh, sorry, you stepped on it. You take your 3d6 of damage and haha, I got you. That's not the point of the whole point of this particular kind of encounter. I think, Chris, you kind of touched on it, right? Is disarming should be multiple steps and allowing for different skills to come into play, not just thievery skills. It may be some smarts in there. There could be some dexterity, like we said before. Could be agility. Could be wisdom. Having to, or some knowledge that they have from arcane, some books that they've read or something. Whatever, it could all play into disarming this trap beyond just thievery kind of skills or rogue type skills coming into it. So I think you made a really good point when you said it's kind of a multi-stage, multi-step thing.
And I think that those stages too also lend itself to be more interesting and more narrative, is as you are solving the beginning pieces of it, new mechanisms slide into place, something turns, something whatever, and that gives the opportunity to make it more apparent that another skill might be better now, rather than the same thief making the same roll over and over for every stage.
For sure. Yep. And then don't forget, again, traps, they could spend a lot of time just looking at the trap and thinking about it and spending a lot of game time. What did we say up front about encounters? They should have stakes. They should have a sense of urgency. They should be driving things forward. So if there's no sense of urgency, that's also going to be tough, because obviously they could if they have all the time in the world to solve the trap, then there's no reason to have it, because they can spend all the time in the world. There should be something that pushes them along, that makes it so they have to engage with it in some shape or manner quickly to get things done. So some stakes, sense of urgency. Yep.
Yeah. And those stakes don't have to be in the immediate location or the present,
right,
too. I mean,
for sure.
If you don't solve the trap, water deep blows up so many miles away or something, like it doesn't have to be a danger to the party themselves. Like there's just a consequence that we don't like, but even if it's not just in the room.
Yep. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And then if the players know that there's something, they should know up front that there's some consequences to being slow to move forward. And in old world, they would throw wandering monsters at you to push you forward, but they can know that there's something on the other side of this that they're trying to get to. And hopefully there's a reason they're trying to push their way through this trap and get to the other side, because there's somebody waiting for them. There's something waiting for them. And it may not be waiting for them if they don't get through quickly. Same thing for the puzzles, right?
Yeah.
And then I think, it doesn't have to, so a trap doesn't have to be just what we think of, some mechanical or magical thing. It could be things like disarming a bomb. That requires multiple steps to take care of it. and takes time to get through that. I have an example, like, and if you're going to play in my Gamehole game, Helix Nebula situation, you might want to skip ahead 30 seconds. But at the end of the adventure, there is kind of a puzzle to figure out how to restart this engine on this starship, and you need to pull a breaker, and then you need to prime the breaker, and then you need to do this, you need to do that, and you kind of learn about how to do that gradually, but you have to remember it, and you have to remember to do it in the right order, and it's a dramatic task to do that in the right order while this icky stuff is trying to envelop you and take over your body, so to speak. So yeah, it doesn't have to just be a trap in the sense of what we think of a trap traditionally.
My example was very similar to that, which was I was in a game where there was a train that was set to go off a cliff or whatever, and the trap was that the engine compartment or whatever was set up in such a way you couldn't stop it. So you had to figure out how that was all rigged together and unrig it so you could successfully not make everybody fly off a cliff.
Yeah, which is always good. And there's that sense of urgency, right? Sense of urgency. Yeah. You're going off the cliff. You're gonna go off the cliff going 88 miles an hour, and then the train's gonna disappear and crash in the future.
Yeah, like that's like an unwritten rule of RPG writing, and it really you should know it. And is that you don't want lots of innocents going off a cliff in a train. I mean, nobody writes it down, but that's there. So you keep that in mind.
That's just a given. So you don't. Yeah. So you don't want to have your players just go, oh, that's a sad thing. I'm just going to jump off the train. Yeah. That's a shame. Yeah. What a crying shame. So. Very, very cool. So, so we talked about traps. That's awesome. Now, the one that everybody kind of thinks about and understands, I think, somewhat intuitively, is the social interaction. So there's a lot to be said there. Tons of examples we've talked about, right? The trial, talking to the king, to try to get him to go to war or be an ally to somebody. There's a lot of examples there. So what's some advice that you might offer to start with to running a social interaction?
The first one that comes to mind, and it's a big one, I think, that may get overlooked, is you want to try to bring some of the things your NPCs have, or your PCs have done through their adventures, either long term or in the short term, that can come into and be used in the social interaction, such as they discovered something in the paper yesterday that makes the person you're talking to puts them in a compromised position, and now they can use that information as leverage, and that's going to make the persuasive chat go their way. Or a couple of days ago, they found a bloody knife in a cubby hole, and they brought it with them. And when that is revealed during the chat, they are going to get a bonus or something to help them, win their argument, that they have these props or evidence with them. So trying to tie in old information, old items, old events into the social interaction, I think, is a great way to kind of make your story more cohesive, make it seem like their time wasn't wasted in the past, and make the actual social interaction more than just, okay, give me a persuasion roll. Is now there is the role, there is the props, there is the support, and we got something more dynamic going on.
That's really good. And we talked about how, like, researching in the library may not be an encounter, but it can pay off for the encounter, and it makes the person who's got the research skill be valuable within this social interaction, because they can bring that information to the table and say, aha, but I saw in the paper, the picture of so-and-so with you standing behind them. So you obviously were there, blah, blah, right, whatever. And then there's, so I think you should also give some benefit for good role playing as people. And when I say good role playing, I'm not talking about somebody who's a great orator and has, silky words, but somebody who puts themselves out there and says, okay, I am going to talk to the king, and I'm going to, say, in talk, and everything they say may be wrong or not the way that they meant to say it, but you knew what they were saying and they were role playing it out. You know, give them some props for that. Now, obviously, if they say something that's a faux pas that they should know better, you can play that into a penalty then. But if they're very earnest in what they're trying to say, and you don't give them a gotcha, it's like, oh, haha, you didn't bow before the king when you addressed him. Haha, I got you. It's like, well, I didn't. My character would know how to do that, right? He would have done that right, even though I didn't think to do it. But if they did bow down and they did show all the courtesy there, you might say, hey, okay, let's give them a little bonus for remembering that from reading the paper previously and taking on or doing their research on the mannerisms of the court and be very courtly or whatever. So give them some payoff for those investments.
Yeah, and you kind of touched upon this, but just so it's stated as its own tip, is that remember that your players are not their characters, and if they said something really out of whack or like in the wrong way or maybe a poor word choice, that was the player doing that. The character
Yes.
would have used the right word. So don't penalize where it was just like they aren't the character, so they didn't know that.
Right. The character would know how to do certain things that the player does not know how to do. So that's like the opposite of player knowledge versus character knowledge. You also have to realize characters know things that the players don't, for sure. Yep. And then I think we talked about this, that the face character may be the leader, may drive the conversation because of the skills they have. But again, find ways for all the characters to contribute. The barbarian, so, in the royal court, when the player character is talking to the Grand Vizier, trying to get the king to go to war, but the Grand Vizier doesn't want to do it and he's going to force him. Maybe the barbarian can intimidate a little bit and take the Grand Vizier off his game so that he's not as forceful as it could be. Meanwhile, while the rogue is looking for an opportunity to, find some information, he can pick something out, that there's a mannerism or something. Just give everybody an opportunity. It's not just the face character getting 30 minutes of screen time. It's everybody. So we mentioned that before, but I think it's super important that we keep social interaction being a party sport instead of a individual sport.
Yeah, and it's in times like these, I think, that a lot of the support mechanics of whatever system come into play that people often forget. They don't, not everybody has to be the lead. And in this one, there usually is a defined lead. So a lot of those different ways to support roles, help roles, whatever come into play.
Yep, for sure. And I have an interesting example of, I have another adventure called, so is this just another bug hunt? Which on the surface sounds like it's going to be a big bad shoot 'em up, shooting aliens left and right, but it kind of twists that a little bit, and there's a lot of social interaction between the players and the colonists that set up the events. So there's a lot of scenes, a lot of encounters between colonists and the players that have nothing to do with combat, and you can actually go that whole adventure and solve the mystery, get through it without ever firing a shot if you wanted to. You could play the scenes socially, or and the interactions can lead to discoveries, or things can go horribly wrong and you're pulling out your gun and you're having a combat. So it can go either way. So I think it's very powerful that you can do that and have that capability, or something that the players can kind of get invested in with RP and emotion and all that sort of thing. So. All right. Yeah. Any other thoughts, or should we talk about Chase?
No, I think we covered this one. Social interaction is, I think, pretty well known, so kind of hard to not repeat yourself.
For sure. So let's talk about Chase then. So Chase, some games have mechanics, some games don't have mechanics. What kind of advice would we give to people who are trying to run a chase? And then what are some examples? What do we mean by a chase, right? What is a chase?
So a chase is either you are running away from something or you're running towards something. And I think one of the important parts is And it doesn't have to be running, by the way. There's a destination and there's movement as a more abstract way to define a chase. But if we're coming into chase scenes and chase scenarios, you want to know where it starts and where it ends ahead of time. I think they can go on too long and get confusing if you don't have a beginning and end, which is part of what I do like about the Savage Worlds particular chase mechanic is that, you lay down 7 cards or 9 cards or whatever. And that's the thing. If you get to the end card, it's done. There's no, you could prolong it, I guess, if you want to, but it's very defined. So, you can see the end coming, you can see where you are, you can tell when you're halfway. I think knowing those boundaries are important to get the urgency in the characters, as they know if they don't get to, when the enemy or opponent or whatever is near the second to last card for them, they know it's almost over. So there is urgency. If they're on the last card, they know it's really almost over. There's a little bit more urgency. So knowing those boundaries, I think, are pretty important.
And the second thing is obviously to make it interesting. You want to have things that get in the way, obstacles, some tactics that have to be involved. If it's purely just each round I'm making a roll to see if I get farther or closer to my target, you really want to have obstacles. You want to have things that affect the characters, and if it can be narrative. And the car chase, you're driving. We're chasing Trinity through the streets of New York City, and the player says, "I'm going to climb on top of the hood and take my grapple and try to pull her closer in." Well, that adds a whole different layer than just, well, we're going to keep driving faster and faster and see if we can catch her and keep doing die rolls. So let the narrative build off and, let the characters sort of be characters and do fun stuff as part of the chase and not just a driver. The driver's not the only person obviously running, everybody's running, but I mean, if you're in a car or something, then it turns into one person. No, it doesn't have to be. Everybody can be involved. And that's another thing that's nice about the chase mechanics in Savage Worlds. But I think other games have very similar mechanisms.
Yeah. The only other thing I would reiterate is the diminishing returns part of this. It just has a sense of urgency thing. You remember their bullets are running out, their thighs are getting tired, their gas is running out of their car. Anything that makes the end different than the beginning, I think, makes it not only memorable but more interesting.
Yep, for sure. And so like we said, I mean, this could be a lot of stuff. It could be, you're chasing guards are chasing you. It could be you're trying to, escape from the police after your heist. It could be 2 starships chasing each other through space, trying to be the first one to reach the spice fields and get the goal there. So there's a lot of stuff you could do with respect to chases. And going back, check your system, see what it has for chases. And like Savage Worlds has a chase mechanic. Actually, it had several of them in its history. But your game may not. And so now it becomes more of how do I bring in those mechanics that it has again to allow me to do chases, skill challenges or, making multiple rounds to do certain things. And then each round there's people get initiative and they just try to take advantage of what your system does. And if it doesn't have this, then it's probably even cooler, right? Because the players probably have never really had a chance to do a chase because the system really isn't designed for it. So if you figure it out, it'll be even more interesting and add a little more juice and a little more flavor to your game to have them go through a chase. And sometimes it's tough to find a good chase, but if you find one, it's just a lot of fun to have people running around crazy trying to get away or catch up. And that last, they're just out of my grasp and they're just about to get away. It's really kind of fun.
Just a note on chases by themselves is if your system doesn't have a chase mechanic, you should either create one or find one, because when you run it in a chase in actual encounter rounds like combat, that is some of the most grueling gameplay, as it takes literally hours, one person at a time, moving their pace. Like it's just
my God,
the wrong tool. Yeah.
Yeah. Get rid of the tactical map is not the way you want to be running a
Yeah.
chase at all, because everybody moves 30 feet and okay. It's
Yeah.
like that's not the best. There are some game systems, that board game systems, that is their bread and butter, is for you to manage every move. Like I used to play Starfleet Battles, and that was like every move is you're calculating it and you're figuring it out and you're doing the. But no, you don't want to do that in your RP, your role playing game. So
Yeah.
cool, very cool. And so the last thing we have is environmental, man against world. So what are some of the things there? This is probably one that people haven't really thought about a lot, as being an encounter. So what kind of things are we talking about there, and what are some things that they can do to make those more interesting?
Yeah, I would say this is a bit of a catch-all category because a lot of things really fall under it. So the one example I usually like to use is uh, getting out of or dealing with a burning building or something where you need to uh, not, and it's not always just like a direct line like a chase would be, because you can do a chase out of a burning building if you wanted to. But maybe you're saving people, maybe you're moving obstacles as you get out. Maybe the actual falling debris poses its own challenge. Um, I think that is a good overall like encounter where you're sort of not really fighting a person. You're just this thing is going to happen, which is a good trait of these two. Is, by the way, is that these are like a foregone conclusion. Is whatever this thing is you're trying to deal with is going to happen or needs to be dealt with. You're not circumventing it. You need to kind of go into action and deal with just how it's going to play out.
Right. You are not going to stop the severe sandstorm from blowing across the dunes that you're trekking through, trying to find the lost temple. You're not going to stop it. It's going to happen, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
and then, but I think that plays right into, this is another one where you got to make the stakes obvious to the characters, because the natural environment they may not really think about, but they need to know that they're in a ship and the oxygen is running out, so that they can try to figure out what they're going to do. They need to know that that's a bad thing that's going to happen to them. They need to know that this extreme weather is going to cause problems if they don't do something about their situation in it. So make sure those stakes are obvious to the players, because it's very easy for them to, it's just weather, no big deal. The game master always just kind of hand waves my travel across the land anyway, and so it'd be very easy for them to not take it seriously.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think you touched upon it already, but if these can if the landscape of the challenge changes as you progress, I think that really adds more flavor to it and more narrative effect. Like the sandstorm examples, we're running from that, and I'm gonna hide behind this rock. Well, you just found that there's another group behind this rock, so now you gotta compete or do something else quickly. But keep changing it up and having stages that progress, I think, is super important.
That's very cool. Yeah, I mean, you can even think about unmovable forces, like undefeatable creatures is one that I think was listed. Like Godzilla, we're not going to defeat in the game. The goal is not to kill Godzilla, because you can't. That should be a conceit that the players understand. They're not going to kill Godzilla, but how do they deal with the ramifications? And that can change as he causes havoc in the city and you're trying to prevent certain things from happening, or what have you. And that might turn more into an adventure with multiple scenes and multiple encounters, but each one in itself isn't going to be a combat against Godzilla, because he's an unmovable force. It's you against the world in this particular situation. So just something to think about when you talk about the kaiju kind of creatures that you'd run into. So it can be lots of stuff, right? The environment, it's
Yeah.
not just, sandstorms, tornadoes, windstorms, whatever. It's lots of stuff that you can think about wherever you're against the world, and not a person, so to speak, or a thing, like a trap. All right. Well, cool. Hey, so any final thoughts that you want to offer up to the folks listening on doing a non-combat encounter?
My final thought is if if you don't have these mixed in or baked in with your daily game or your weekly game, I imagine you probably don't play daily. Your weekly game or your monthly game or your regular game, I would try to. I mean, try one or two, or see what fits, what works. Ditch what doesn't. Mix it up. They're going to be a little uncomfortable when you first try it, but I think they really do enrich the game and make it so your players are constantly surprised, constantly thinking out of the box, being more creative, getting a little bit of the unexpected when they play again, and just a great tool overall.
Yep. Yep. Very good way of stating it. And I'll just leave off with just remember have stakes that are understandable, a sense of urgency that drives them forward to actually engage in the encounter. There's things for them to do. They're not just passive participants. They're doing something to change their situation. And there's stages or multiple die rolls. It's not just the thief saying, I'm picking the lock, and it's all done. So anyway, that is a look at non-combat encounters. So, hey, thanks everyone for tuning in. I hope you got something out of it. Remember to drop by masteringtherepg.com to learn about all the other projects we're working on and to contact and support us. Please email gamemaster@masteringtherepg.com if you have any questions, need some advice. I always say Eric would love to adjudicate differences of opinion, and we've yet to get one, so please send us one if you got one. And if you like the show, hey, give us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts and wherever you do your reviews. We'd love that. Tell your friends, drop it on social media. You can follow, just point out to your friends what we do, and that's probably the best thing you can do for us if you like the show. So once again, this is Carl, normally with Eric, but not today, and with Chris, saying goodbye, guys.